Hello, my name is Björn Fischer and I'm the author of the book Rock-O-Rama Records, the outrageous story of the Bizarrest music label emerging from the punk movement. It's over 700 pages long and is about the infamous German record label Rock-O-Rama Records, which was founded in the late 1970s, first released punk records from German bands like Chaos Z, Razors and Kotzbrocken, then hardcore punk from Finland like Appendix, Resetit and Helvet Kedat, and finally international RAC bands like Screwdriver, Brutal Attack and Bound for Glory. The RAC era led to demonstrations against the Rock-O-Rama record shop in Cologne and later to house searches, confiscations, indexing, court cases and so on. So today I'm going to read you an extract of my book. Herbert Egold knew how to build up a subcultural label, but he wasn't able to support the bands in the way you would expect from a professional label with such sales figures, says Thorsten Lemmer, who was one of Rock-O-Rama's strongest competitors in the mid-1990s with his label Funny Sounds. Because he was a craftsman and not a media designer, he did everything I had to do as a manager and music producer. The wholesale market opened up for him with right-wing rock at a time when so-called social fringe groups such as mods, teds, psychobillies, punks and skins were still sticking together in many places. I myself got into rockabilly at the age of 12 because I liked Stray Cats and went to Truck Stop concerts, Germany's most famous country music band, along with Skins and Punks. Punks weren't automatically left-wing in those days. It was a way of life and some had a different political attitude and became skinheads, for example. At that time, Herbert got into Screwdriver and Böse Onkels. It didn't matter to him whether you were a punk with a no-future attitude or a right-wing skinhead who felt like a working-class hero. And out of this attitude towards life, Herbert released these right-wing records as well as left-wing ones. Because when Kotzbrocken or others sang, "We're going to beat the crap out of the cops," he thought Ian Stewart could sing too, "If a black guy comes around the corner and makes a fool of me, I'll punch him on the nose." Herbert didn't make any difference. He was not politically right-wing, but rather declared this subculture to be his business model and thus became the almost sole ruler of the right-wing rock market for some time. His own punk productions disappeared, but he kept the records on offer, had them reprinted later in smaller editions and tried to continue to include politically non-right-wing recordings in his program. Also for criminal law reasons, because if you don't sell exclusively neo-Nazi music, you may be committing a crime, but it's not intentional, and that has a mitigating effect on your sentence. He had the same lawyer as me, and from 1989 he had his recordings independently checked for criminal content before the bands were sent to the studio. But some bands also screwed him over because he didn't pay them that well. The checked lyrics no longer had much in common with the lyrics sung in the studio. At this point, Herbert was no longer present at the studio recordings and didn't even listen to the records after they were released. He didn't show up at concerts either. Many bands were disappointed by his business model and therefore usually didn't speak well of him. With Böse Onkels, he once said, "There was only stress in arguments." The deal, studio costs and 10% of the first edition was initially the same for right-wing as for punk productions. By the time the first Störkraft record came out in the late 1980s, the demand was so high, similar to Endstufe by the way, that Herbert could no longer keep the old contracts. Störkraft sometimes got 6 or 7 days of studio time and could have got an 8th day if they needed the time. I myself was of the opinion that only 1 track per studio day should be recorded for a production. In my case, there wasn't this 10% deal, but it was decided beforehand what the band would get in terms of fixed money. Kraftschlag, for example, gave me their fully mixed DAT tape and received 25,000 Deutschmark directly from me, regardless of how well or badly the CD sold later. Of course, this put Herbert under pressure and he discussed it with me several times. It didn't matter to me whether I earned 50,000 Deutschmark from a band or just 48,000, because it was more important that the band stayed with me, was good to me and said positive things about me. He, on the other hand, was extremely stingy and only paid those people from whom he expected a lot. Ian Stewart received money regularly, as did his guitarist Stigger, Brutal Attack and a few others. Herbert paid 5,000 Deutschmark for a Dutch studio recording of the band Hauptkampflinie. So it's not that he never gave away anything to anyone. He wouldn't have been able to sustain himself with that. When Störkraft were at their peak, he gave the singer 10,000 Deutschmark and a new Nissan Jeep for 30,000 Deutschmark, while the drummer only received a gold chain worth 500 Deutschmark. After their appearance on the TV channel Sat.1 program Einspruch Objection in 1992, the band managed to sell 60,000 copies in 30 days. Shortly afterwards, the band split up due to legal persecution and the singer was given a few years probation. Then, for some reasons of camouflage, more and more sub-labels were set up and Herbert largely refrained from mentioning the name Rock-O-Rama on his recordings, which had been his #1 advertising identifier before. In those days, a record would be played at a party and people would immediately note down the Brühl address. These are things that are memorable, the black label with the address as well as the mail order catalogue. At peak times, I had over 50,000 customers who ordered more than one record from me within 6 months. It can be assumed that Herbert had almost twice as many. His warehouse in Alsdorfer Straße consisted of several halls and was even his property at times. In one of the halls of his warehouse there was a CD burning facility which he used to produce recordings on demand so that he wouldn't have too much stock which could then be confiscated. The blank discs went in at the top and the finished printed CDs came out at the end. This meant that he could produce around 1,000 discs a night and didn't have to have 3,000 or 10,000 CDs pressed externally for each new release or re-release. The warehouse also contained his extensive stock of rockabilly records from the past, but these were not sold and did not appear on his distribution lists. Herbert was very fond of rockabilly music. He never said so, but he encouraged Ian Stewart, for example, to form the Klansmen. He also liked country music and once went to see Johnny Cash in Paris. He never said anything negative to me about Stewart since he was the door opener to his multi-million-dollar empire. And with the reunification of Germany and the collapse of the East, sales shot up all at once. In order to be able to continue to offer his older indexed recordings, for example titles such as Störkraft, Dreckig Karl und Hundsgemein, Böse Onkels, Der nette Mann or Der Clou bei Endstufe, Herbert added individually copied sheets to larger orders with an address in Belgium where these items could be obtained. He assumed that no leftists would order large quantities from him anyway and that the matter would therefore not be exposed. This allowed him to legally deliver everything to another trader from abroad at a slightly higher unit price and thus also satisfying his numerous new customers. He also bought a property in Belgium and the majority shares in the Pure Impact label. He was also very interested in other indexed records and always wanted to swap the few we produced. We often exchanged invoices. My new Sturmwehr CD came out as well as his new Freikorps album, so we bought 5,000 copies from each other and each wrote an invoice, which was then cancelled. Despite his great distrust, he eventually accepted me completely. Apart from us, there were also a lot of small and odd companies which sprung up all over Germany, made 1 or 2 music productions, and wanted to swap their records with Herbert and me. They offered 100 copies of them and got, for example, 10 copies of 10 different recordings from us, which sold well in their small mail orders. And I needed some copies of every record, whether it was good or bad. 2,000 to 3,000 copies were always sold within 3 or 4 months, even in the worst final phase, when pirate copies and CD home burning were the order of the day. We made good money. I had Rolex watches, several cars and motorbikes, and traveled the world. Herbert bought vintage cars, as an investment old Cadillacs, and invested in real estate. As far back as I can remember, this included Leipzig and Gera, where after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the German reunification, he acquired old houses through a joint venture and had them repaired. He wasn't much of a vacation and liked things to be more down to earth. So I hope my reading has aroused some interest in the subject. Please feel free to leave your comment here. If you want to order directly from the publisher, you will find a link in the text below. Thanks for watching and see you soon.